Welcome to the Motivational Midwife. My name's Lynn Jones, and today we're going to look at the Resusitaire and how to check it. So recently I was working with some students and we were talking about the Resusitaire and how to check it, and I thought it actually might be useful to do a short video on looking at the Resusitaire and various components of it and things to consider when you're checking it. So this is one of a variety of Resusitaires. There's all sorts of different types on the market, and you may have one exactly like this in your trust, or it may be slightly different, but essentially they all have exactly the same things on them. They are a firm flat surface on which to undertake your resuscitation. They have a heat source, they have light, and they have a gas supply, so air and oxygen supply. This one also happens to have a oxygen saturation monitor on the little table to the right, and it has a copy of the NLS algorithm also on it, which is quite useful to have on there. What you can also see on this particular Resusitaire is the trust have actually put a little label on there with the acceptable oxygen saturations at each number of minutes post-birth. So this Resusitaire, as you can see, it's on a postnatal ward. It's not plugged in to a gas supply. So the gas supply, the air and the oxygen, will be provided by cylinders that are attached to the back of the Resusitaire. In delivery areas, they are very often attached to a continuous gas supply in the wall in the room that they're in. If you are checking how much oxygen and air is left in the cylinders, it's really important that you actually turn those cylinders off first, drain them, turn them off, and then disconnect the gas supply from the wall before you then turn the cylinders back on, and that will give you a reasonably accurate amount of how much gas is left in that cylinder and whether or not it needs to be changed. Now, depending on the size of the cylinder that are attached to the back of the Resusitaire, a full cylinder is only going to give you between 15, 20 minutes or 30 minutes resuscitation, active resuscitation time. So if you are in an area that is not plugged into a continuous supply, gas supply from the wall, then it's really important that if in the event of an active resuscitation, you are aware of how much gas is left in those cylinders, because that is going to dictate whether or not you need to move this Resusitaire quickly to a area that you can plug into a main supply. So let's look at the control panel in a little bit more detail. So what's on the control panel, again, will vary slightly depending on the make and model of the Resusitaire that's in your trust, but do become familiar with which ones are actually in your trust. But essentially, they're all going to be very, very similar. So they will all have an on-off button, so it's not going to work unless it's plugged in and there's a power supply to it. So we do need to switch that button on. And they will all have some sort of clock or timer, which you should start as soon as the baby is put on the Resusitaire. This one here has, to the left of it, it's got the two small buttons that you can reset it and switch it on and off. I'd say starting the clock is probably the one thing that most of us actually forget to do as soon as we put the baby on the Resusitaire. It's not always the first thing that pops into your mind, but actually it does give an indication of how long you have been resuscitating this baby or helping it make that transition from in utero to extra utero life. Then below that, you've got a heat control. So there are 3 settings on this particular model. You've got preheat. So preheat, you would have it on all the time. And again, that very much depends on the area that the Resusitaire is situated. So if you have one in each delivery room, which some trusts are fortunate enough to have, then that tends to be plugged in and kept on preheat, or should be, most of the time, because sometimes you will get a baby unexpectedly requiring some assistance to make that transition. And if that's the case, putting a baby on cold towels is actually going to impact on its heat loss. So babies, as you know, will lose heat from conduction, convection, radiation, and evaporation. So if those towels are warm, we're going to minimise that amount of heat loss. And cold babies are much harder to resuscitate because they're using up their resources to actually generate some heat. And there is another video on the neonatal energy triangle, which will explain that in a little bit more detail. So below the pre-warm button, you have a manual one, and you can set the temperature in terms up and down as to what you feel would be useful. So if in the event that you needed to heat those towels very, very quickly, you might put it on manual, and with the up and down arrows that you can see just under here, and those bars, the orange bars to your right, that is fully over. So it will tell you that the heater is as high as it will go. I suspect this picture was taken just as it had been switched on, or it had been on manual, set up to full, and then it's just been put back down to pre-warm. Because pre-warm usually doesn't have all the orange bars in there. It's normally 2 or 3. The last one on there, and you need to check that when you're checking the Resusitaire, check that each of these, certainly the manual and the pre-warm, do work. And if you switch it up to full by pushing the up button, you will feel and sometimes see the radiant heat above you. And you definitely will feel it. The button underneath that is for baby, and this, in order for this to work, it needs to have a temperature probe actually attached to the baby. So there's the inlet where you would plug in one end of the temperature probe, and the other end would be attached to the baby. And then by means of the up and down arrows, again, you would set the temperature that you want. So if you want the baby's temperature to be 37 degrees, you would set it at 37 degrees, and then the machine will automatically adjust the heat to get the baby up to that temperature. There's the light source button, which is often next to the on-off button. So when my personal practice, when I'm checking a Resusitaire, is I'll switch it on and I'll switch the light on straight away as well. Below that, we've got the oxygen blender, and for term babies, we resuscitate in air. So the amount of oxygen that's present in air is 21%. So this should be set on 21%, which is the lowest setting on that dial. If it was a preterm baby, very preterm baby, you may consider starting resuscitation in 30% oxygen, so it may get turned up a little bit. And if cardiac compressions were underway, it should be turned up to 100%. But very often the titration of the oxygen is done by the neonatal team, not necessarily the midwife. There is a lock that the settings can be locked there. Generally, I don't think I've ever seen anyone use the lock. And then we come down to suction. So this is your suction reading, and this will tell you the pressure at which the suction is set at. And if you need to adjust it, the adjustment dial is next to it. So in order to check the suction, you will need to occlude the tubing in some way. Usually you can just bend the tubing, and that will allow you to see how much pressure that is set at. 30 centimetres of water pressure is perfectly enough for suction, but you will see it sometimes, certainly by the neonatal team, turned up much higher. But given that we are not routinely using the suction, then really we just need to be checking that it's at least set at 30. You should also, on your Resusitaire, check that you actually have a pediatric wide bore Yanker sucker, which is or an alternative, but it has to be wide bore pediatric suction catheter. And this is in line with the Resuscitation Guidance Council, because we should only be suctioning large particulates, so things like lumps of meconium or a blood clot or lump of vernix. Actually, sort of fluid shouldn't be suctioned at all. And on some models like this one, there is an auto breath facility. Generally, in most units, this isn't used, but it may be used if there's an ongoing resuscitation or in neonatal special care units. Potentially, it could get used there, but in most other areas, the auto breath doesn't usually get used that much anymore. So the next thing we come on to is the pressure reading. So this is the amount of pressure that is used to actually clear those babies' lungs of fluid and aerate the lungs. So in a term baby, you're looking at 30 centimetres of water pressure, and that's just the measurement that's used is centimetres of water pressure. So you just need to make sure that the dial is set at 30. And if it's a preterm baby, that might be turned down to 25 centimetres of water pressure. Now, you've got two types of pressure there. You've got your PEEP, which is your positive end expiratory pressure. And that is the amount of air that's kind of at the end of a breath is left in your airways or in the alveoli to keep them open. And so for the babies, that should be 5 centimetres of water pressure. And how you would adjust that is on your mask, you'd occlude the end that's going to the baby. And most of those have got a little T-piece at the top where you can turn the dial, and that will adjust the pressure reading. To adjust the PIP, which is your positive inspiratory pressure, which is the amount of pressure needed to actually clear those lungs, you occlude both the end that's going to the baby and the end that comes from the machine, and then you turn this pressure adjustment dial until it sits at 30. I haven't got a nice round silicone mask, I'm afraid. I've only got one of these little ones that came with a bag valve. So you would use that on your silicone mask, which would be attached to your T-piece that attaches in this gas outlet section of the Resusitaire. And then at the bottom, the two dials you've got there are how much air and oxygen is left in the cylinders. And as I said to you earlier, you need to make sure that you have drained them first. So you switch them off, drain them, unplug any leads that are attached to main gas supplies, and then switch them back on. And then that will give you your reading of how much is left in the cylinders. Now, it's important to note that obviously your suction and your gas supply, if you don't turn your gas supply on, then definitely the suction and the pressures are just it's not going to work. So you need to switch those on. So in the event of a real resuscitation, you would be switching on your light, your timer, and your gas supply, and then you're pretty much good to go. So underneath most resuscitaires, there are drawers, and these are full of other things that may be required. Now, what is exactly in those drawers will very much depend on the trust you're working at. Each trust may have different things that they want in here. But in these drawers, we've got a collection of spare silicone masks. So you'll usually have a small one, a 00, and a size 1, or a 0 and a size 1. So that usually covers your preterm babies and your term babies. Then you will have laryngoscopes, and you might have various sizes of those. Now, the laryngoscopes are very often disposable, And even though they're in the bag, you should just try and click the handle up so you're checking that the light actually does work, because if it doesn't work, then it's not going to be much use to the person needing to use it. And there's normally enough space in that bag to allow you to do that. They are single use, as I say, so once they've been used on a baby, they would be disposed of. In this drawer here, we've got an eye gel. We've also got some pediatric Yanker suckers, and we've got some hats. There is some sterile plastic bags, a couple of sizes of those. So if you have a very preterm baby, depending on how preterm, you would pick the correct size, and the baby would be delivered straight into that plastic bag. So resuscitation is slightly adapted for preterm babies. This one actually has a bag and valve mask in here as well, and also some spare suction tubing and tubing that goes from the Resusitaire to the silicone mask for your T-piece. And there are some other suction catheters in there as well. And there you have it. I hope you found that useful. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do, and please spread the word amongst your student colleagues or anyone else you feel that might be interested. Our Facebook page is The Motivational Midwife, and I look forward to seeing you next time.